In the first series on the challenge of Jesus, I didn't have to begin by justifying talking about Jesus. Paul needs some justification because for many people, and I'm talking Christians and non-Christians, Jesus is appealing and Paul is appalling. So I need to justify, I need to explain why I'm interested in Paul, because how and why I became interested in Paul is going to be very important for how I see Paul and how I think we all should see Paul. Let me go way back. Growing up in Ireland in the 30s and the 40s, Paul was just the minor person in the feast day of Peter and Paul. Peter and Paul. Paul sort of was hanging on to Peter. Years later, we'd be up to 57, 59. I did a doctorate at Maynooth College, the National Seminary of Ireland. It was called On the Image of Humanity in Philo and Paul. At the end of 2 years, I passed my doctorate, did my dissertation, defended it in Latin. Most of what I was saying I didn't understand. Most of the questions I didn't understand either. They were all in Latin. But anyway, got my doctorate and immediately lost any interest in Philo and Paul. Next stage, I went right away to the Biblical Institute in Rome, and I had a full year's course on Paul. It was by Stanislaus Leone, a Jesuit, fine scholar, so fine in fact that he was silenced by the Vatican pretty soon after he finished the course, and only was allowed back to teach during Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council. Anyway, his course on Paul was not on all of Paul's epistles. It was on Romans, but it wasn't even on all of Romans, not even on all of a chapter of Romans. It wasn't even on a whole verse of Romans. It was on Romans 5:12b. The phrase, in whom all have sinned. Adam, in whom all have sinned. What he did that year was go completely through all the Latin and Greek authors to ask whether this was some sort of a genetic stain, original sin that was transmitted to us in our genes, as it were. Or was it simply bad example? We all sinned because Adam gave us some very primordial, inaugural bad example. And that was what he was arguing. There was no genetic stain, it was simply bad example. That's what got him in trouble, of course. So at the end of a full year on Paul, I knew all about, more than I really wanted to know about, one part of one verse. Paul was still not in my interest at all. But if you look at the books I've written, The Historical Jesus, The Birth of Christianity, In Search of Paul, co-authored with the archaeologist Jonathan Reed, you think, well, I'm working my way towards Paul. That's not the way it happened at all. In the year 2000, our friends Marianne and Marcus Borg asked Sarah and myself, would we like to become leaders with them, taking 40 people every year in the footsteps of Paul across Turkey? Year 2000. That's when something happened. Because when I started to work on Paul in his own environment, Paul among the ruins of the Roman Empire, I started reading the primary texts of Paul in Turkey. Okay, confession. I read almost nothing of the secondary literature on Paul. Most of it I couldn't stand. I couldn't even understand how this had anything to do with the Paul I was reading among the ruins of the Roman Empire. That's where it happened. That's where it happened for me. That's when Paul came alive. Because I began to understand that Paul was taking on the Roman Empire. This was not Christianity against Judaism. This was Christian Judaism against Roman imperialism. And we watched people whom we brought there, sitting in the ruins of the Roman Empire, reading the titles of Caesar, Son of God, Divine, Lord, Savior of the world, and realizing Paul is taking on imperialism. And of course, if Roman imperialism, then also American imperialism. So everything changed. And here's where I think we have to understand Paul. Take him out of the 16th century Reformation. That's not his matrix. asking him questions about that he was not interested in and couldn't answer. Put him back in his Roman matrix, out of the 16th, back in the 1st century. Let him speak the language that'll get him executed eventually. And realize that that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the injustice of imperialism. Out of the heart of Judaism, Christian Judaism, Messianic Judaism, he's speaking against the Roman Empire. Second thing, as equally important, imagine if Paul wrote a letter to the Christians in America. We know he wrote, to the Romans, to the Philippians. Let's see, to the Americans. He might say something like this. I read that you talk about inalienable rights, God-given rights, rights from creation, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness you mentioned. And I like that, says Paul, because it reminds me of Genesis chapter 1. And you have this thing, a little strange for me, but it's your world, called the Pledge of Allegiance. And you talk about being under God with liberty and justice for all. And that, I like that, because that's what the whole Bible is about, and that's what I've been writing about, liberty and justice for all under God. By the way, dear Americans, I do notice that you seem excited about this under God phrase. Don't worry about it. If you establish liberty and justice for all, you'll be under God whether you know it or not. But I'd like to ask you Americans a question, says Paul. Dear Americans, dear fellow Christians in America, how is it going for you? How are you doing on inalienable rights for everyone in the whole world, apparently? How are you doing on liberty and justice for all? How is it going for you? So, as I turn from this prologue to the challenge of Paul, two things please keep in mind. Take him out of the 16th century, put him back where he belongs in the 1st. And don't think, whenever he speaks about Rome, he's speaking only to Rome. He is speaking also to us.
Funding for this program is provided by a generous contribution from Barbara Wendland, a lifelong member of the United Methodist Church and a faithful supporter of Faith and Reason.